A lot of Christians today don't necessarily have any kind of background in that because I don't think the church has done a really good job of talking about apologetics, which is a great shame, because if you do not have the conviction of feeling like, yes, I can be confident that Christianity is true, like we were talking about earlier, it's not just a guess, it's not just, oh, well, yeah, this is what I believe because I grew up in America or whatever, but no, this is actually objective truth. It corresponds to reality. When you know that, you're going to be a lot more comfortable standing up for what you believe. You're going to be a lot more comfortable in the face of hostility because you're going to know, well, this is true, right?
Revolution of common sense.
Revolution of common sense.
A revolution of common sense.
Truth was once common sense, but today, truth is uncommon. Explore biblical truths around faith, business, and politics with Peter Demas. Uncommon sense in current times.
Hey folks, welcome to Uncommon Sense in Current Times. I'm real excited to be here with Natasha Crain. She's a national speaker, author, podcaster. She's passionate about helping Christians think clearly and confidently about living a biblical worldview in today's secular culture. She's written several books and articles, including a great article out there that you can find on addressing the God Gets Us campaign. But we're here really to talk about her most recent book, which I got over here, my shoulder here, was When Culture Hates You. So Natasha, thank you so much for being on this program. I appreciate you being here.
Yeah, it's great to talk with you.
So I'm curious, if cultural hostility signals truth, how do we avoid the fallacy of appeal to persecution, just assuming something is true because it's unpopular?
Yeah, this is a good question because a lot of times people will hear a title like When Culture Hates You, and I've seen this in some comments online from people on social media, and it's like, oh, you Christians, you always think everybody hates you, right? You're being persecuted. And in some sense, we definitely are being discriminated against in America, and we can talk about that, and there's far greater persecution against Christians in other parts of the world. But Jesus did say that the world would hate us. And that's a lot about how I start the book off, is just helping Christians to understand that just because people hate you, it doesn't mean that you have necessarily done something wrong. So Jesus says that if the world hates you, know that it has hated me before it hated you. If you were of the world world would love you as its own. And so he's telling his followers this, and there's this expectation that when you are telling people the truth about reality, that it's going to be offensive. And so we know that the world is going to hate that message. And so we can continue on and unpack that more later. But there's also the other side of this, where sometimes Christians go too far the other way and saying, well, if people are mad at me, that's totally on them. For sure, that's on them because Jesus said the world would hate us. And they're really familiar with what Jesus said, but they use that as a justification for sharing truth in a lot of ungodly ways. And so we want to be good balancers of sharing truth in grace with love, always being motivated from the right place. And I think that's the key to it. To be motivated by love for someone else is going to mean that you're going to share truth in a way that they're going to best receive it. Doesn't guarantee that they're going to love you for it. That's where we have to understand. Jesus said the world's going to hate the message, but we do know that they're hating the message, and they're not hating it because we are a bad messenger.
So, when I think about historically, and I think about the Pharisees, for example, they recognized that the world pretty much hated them. They didn't agree with the monotheism that they had. They didn't, and as a result, they kind of use that as, at least the way I read it, as everybody else is wrong and we're right. And so when someone like Jesus comes along, or John the Baptist even, there's that persecution complex. Do you think Christians fall under that pattern? When we think about something like this, do you think we have a tendency to kind of fall back into that almost legalism, but in regards to culture itself?
I definitely think that we can. It's entirely possible. That's why we always have to check our motivations and our understanding. I think that we have on the opposite end, though, a lot of times a problem when people think that, well, we can't claim to be right? There's this almost like a fear of claiming that objectively what is true about the world. Because God is sort of, I talk about this in my last book, and Faithfully Different, that the secular view of God is not necessarily that he doesn't exist, but that he's just kind of anyone's best guess. Like, no one really knows, right? We're all just kind of in the same position. No one really has any evidence. It's kind of like whatever you think. And a lot of times Christians have absorbed that view so that we're afraid to make any kind of truth claims with confidence because we assume that, well, we can't know for sure. And so I think that's also a trap that people fall into, is we don't want to say anything with any kind of certainty because culture pushes back and they say, well, who are you? Who are you to say that you know this with certainty? So I think that I do see that a lot. But to your point, we can get into a mode of thinking that even on the finest details, things that Christians have disagreed about for centuries on secondary issues, that we know everything. We are completely right about everything. There's no room for disagreement, and that's where we have to get into those conversations about, well, where can you agree to disagree? What is the church said historically? What can we gather from the Bible? Because today, what you see is that certain things that have always been secondary issues, or secondary issues that people have disagreed about, such as baptism, now people are trying to widen that net and say that would include something like the sanctity of life, or that it would include sexuality. So those are things that historically the church would not agree to disagree on. So we have to be really careful in understanding what those issues are and where are the issues that are still within the historic faith.
Do you think that the problems that the church had back in, I'm going to take kind of in my age, the 80s and 90s, where they were fighting over things such as baptism, or whether or not the wine for communion is supposed to be real wine or grape juice, and you're allowed to have coffee in the sanctuary, the type of music, all the stuff that seemed to be kind of the fight that was there. Do you think because we were fighting those areas that we kind of let culture take a front seat?
Well, it could be. I mean, I think that there are a lot of different factors if you look back at history that lead to where we are today. But I think that we've lost perspective a lot of times, if that's what you mean, that, we've been going back and forth between some of those issues in house discussions, and we have not really been paying attention to what's going on in culture. That said, it's not something when we look around the world today and we say, wow, things are starting to get really crazy in our country. Everything's changing. And, what's been happening? Why are so many people walking away from the faith? That has not just happened. That is not something that, even if we've just noticed that it's happening, it has not just happened. And so, speaking of history, when you look back, these are trends that you can trace hundreds of years back, starting with the Enlightenment and all of the changes to philosophy and everything that has happened since then, especially since the beginning of the 1900s. And so historically, you can see all those changes and the ways that Christians have responded, sometimes well, sometimes not so well. Especially in the beginning of the 1900s, we were kind of known for pulling out of the public square. We were like, well, we're just going to be over here. We're not going to worry so much about those things. And so you see a long trend of all of these kinds of discussions taking place, and Christians trying to figure out, how do we navigate this? Because it's so different today than it was at the founding of our country. When we're talking about the time of the American Revolution, for example, 98% of the country was Protestant Christian, even if in a nominal sense. So that was going to look very different as a society than it is today. Things have changed a lot, and there are a lot of factors that have gone into that.
So when you toward the end of your book, you talk about the cultural flashpoints. I think you mentioned abortion, social justice, Christian nationalism, critical theory. I can't remember what the fifth one is, but you talk about these, but is that not a problem of us looking downstream and kind of allowing culture to dictate where the battlefield is, instead of focusing on things such as identity, purity, freedom through Christ, and what is truth, and those things? By us kind of engaging in those areas, are we not allowing culture to dictate the terms of which we're fighting?
Well, that's an interesting question. I was thinking about this recently, actually, that a few years ago, so I have a blog that I started writing back in 2011, and the blog has changed a lot since I first started it. It used to be just a Christian parenting blog, and then it evolved eventually into cultural issues, all kinds of things. But a few years back, I wrote a blog post, and the title was something like, "Hey, Christians, we have a lot more to talk about with the world around us than same-sex marriage," and something along those lines, than same-sex marriage, because that's what everyone was talking about at the time. And my point in that article was just to help Christians think about, yes, this is a cultural issue. It's a big deal. It's not something to trivialize. At the same time, how often are we also talking about, hey, there's evidence for God's existence. There's evidence for the resurrection of Jesus, that these are historical truth claims. Getting people, in other words, to think about the fact that Christianity is grounded in good reason. Hey, have you checked out the good reason for Christianity being true? And getting people to think about that, because sometimes we can get so caught up in the cultural issues, the things that we have to be dealing with in the public square, that we forget we have a lot more to share proactively with the people around us. That's not just a cultural issue. And so I was thinking about that the other day, because in a sense, I think I was very right in that, but in another sense, I do disagree with myself a little bit on that today. And the reason for that is that, yes, we can be talking about those things, but a lot of times, those things meaning apologetics, but a lot of times when the culture is bringing these issues to us, we can't just sit back and we can't say, well, we're going to just be over here focusing on apologetics or the gospel, whatever you might say. The problem is that we live in a constitutional republic. That's not a problem. Actually, it's a good thing. But the problem for this way of thinking that we're just going to back out is that when we as Christians have the opportunity to live in a country with this form of government, we have the opportunity to influence our government in a godly way, to advocate for what is truly good according to God's standards and against what is truly evil according to God's standards, which is, by Romans 13, the definition of what government is supposed to do. So we have this amazing opportunity. Now, if the culture wasn't saying, hey, it's okay if you want to kill your baby, we wouldn't have to be having that conversation. But it becomes our responsibility as Christians when the culture starts wanting to change society for what we know is objectively harmful. Now it's our responsibility that we have to jump in and we have to advocate for what is right. Advocating for righteousness in society is actually a responsibility that we have when we live in this form of government. So that's a lot of what When Culture Hates You is about, is just helping Christians think through those issues of what that looks like to engage in the public square. A lot of these issues are coming to us. We weren't the ones who were bringing these up necessarily. It's just that this is where the culture has gone as it's moved further and further away from its Christian roots, and we have to respond.
You know, I think of Wilberforce and what he did to combat slavery and the slave trade. He didn't argue the way that we see it today. He acknowledged, like, okay, look, we know this is going to be an economic. Here's a practical way of dealing with the economics while also maintaining we have a moral right and as a Christian nation at the time. To address these issues. So he kind of seemed to approach it from two different ways. Do you find that should be the way that Christians should approach these issues, or should it be, okay, my skill set is here on the practical side and your skill set is here more on the theoretical, and then we just kind of work on that itself? Like, what do you think is the best way for Christians today to approach that?
Yeah, well, we have to find some touch points with society, right? Because obviously, when people say, oh, our society is so polarized, well, yeah, it's polarized, not just because we have some kind of different political opinions, but underlying these political opinions usually are very different worldviews. And so if we're coming to the conversation in society about abortion, for example, and we're saying, hey, our view on this is rooted in a worldview that human beings are created as extremely valuable image bearers of God, and therefore you should not kill a human being no matter what stage they're at. If we're making this case from that perspective, of course that's rooted in our worldview. And if you're talking to someone who, for example, might be an atheist who believes that a baby and really anyone else is just a clump of cells and there's no inherent value to human life, then they're not going to resonate necessarily with that. But that said, there is a lot of overlap for people. There are many, many people today who haven't really thought about their worldview that much. Of course, they hold a worldview. Everyone does. Everyone has these basic answers in their own minds about who we are as people and why we're here. Is there a purpose? It might not be a consistent, logically coherent worldview, as we know from research, but they're going to have a worldview. And most of the time, as we know from Romans 1, people are suppressing the truth in unrighteousness. And so if we come to these conversations knowing that deep down, as Christians, we know people actually do know a lot more about truth than they're going to let on or even are conscious about. If we come to the conversations knowing that, we can pull that out of them. When we start to put reality in front of them about, again, just using the abortion as an example, about how this is a human being, to show pictures of babies at different stages and videos of explain what actually happens. There have been many people who have worked in abortion clinics who, when they actually saw the reality of it, changed their minds. They said, I can't do this anymore. And that doesn't mean that they're Christians. It doesn't mean that they even share a worldview, but they still have this knowledge, this deep-rooted knowledge, which I think is what Romans 1 is speaking to, that this is not okay, that this is actually morally wrong. They might not be able to explain why it is, but they see that and they know it's a problem. And even as a practical point, I think you've seen a lot of people change their minds about in the whole transgender issue with respect to sports, because when people have, theoretically supported gender ideology, and then they see some video where there is a biological male playing volleyball in a female sport, and then he clobbers somebody, that's just a real practical consideration that, again, it's not necessarily that they're changing their worldview and they suddenly think, wow, God made two sexes. It's male and female. Now I see everything from a Christian perspective. That's not it. They're saying, yeah, I know that biologically men are different than women in this sense, and it's not fair. So you'll hear people say it's not fair for men to be in women's sports. Of course, that's not consistent with the rest of what they claim to believe, but they're seeing it on that practical level. So I guess I would answer your question in those two parts, that sometimes I think we can touch on what people know to be true about morality that they won't recognize necessarily on their own, per Romans 1. And then in other cases, it's just a mere question of practicality that they see that and go, yeah, we can't have boys clobbering women in women's sports.
Did you know that sitting all day can significantly impact blood circulation? I mean, look up, there's a ton of research on it. Your leg and calf muscles help pump blood back to your heart. So when you sit, blood pools in your legs. And further, studies show that sitting decreases nitric oxide production, making vessels less able to expand. This is why, like in the afternoons, or if you've been sitting for a long time, you start noticing low energy, brain fog, or just kind of feeling a step slower. It might be creeping in on you after a while. And a lot of that could be linked to your circulation. So Juvedon has created Blood Flow 7. It is designed to support healthy nitric oxide levels, which helps your blood vessels relax, open up, improving oxygen and nutrient delivery to your brain, heart, and muscles. That means better stamina, mental clarity, and overall vitality without caffeine or stimulants. It's made with clinically studied natural ingredients, and in research, these have been shown to boost nitric oxide by as much as 230% in just a few hours. It helps open arteries for smoother blood flow. So there's just 2 easy capsules a day. There's no mess, no fuss, and you're supporting your heart health, your healthy blood pressure, and more energy to power through the day. So check it out at bloodflow7, that's the number 7.com/uncommon, or you can click the link in the description. That's bloodflow number 7, so bloodflow7.com/uncommon. It is just common sense. I can't remember if it was a book. I read this back in the probably early 90s. It was a book by either Dershowitz or William Kunstler. I can't remember which. Was a lawyer, and talking about how surprised he was that the feminists and Christians would come together to fight pornography. And they did not have the same worldview, but they did have the same end result in mind, which was to eliminate to eliminate pornography, basically. And so we do see where there could be different alliances, but at the same time, it feels like, and I don't know if it's because social media makes us feel maybe it was always this way, but it feels like there is this increase hostility if you are saying something or doing something against the cultural norm. And maybe again, it's just being projected where the people are out there just screaming crazy, and it was there before the news just didn't cover it. So I don't know exactly, if it's real or not, but it feels that way that's there. From that side of it, now I know you've never had anyone disagree with you probably ever in anything you've written. So, but
Never.
but how do we embrace like this hostility toward us without being combative? Because I know that my personal experience, there are times where I'm like, okay, this is fine, and then there are some times where I want to punch him in the face, and so you deal with these emotions and these feelings. How do we deal with those feelings as Christians? How do we handle this?
Yeah, and we all have those feelings. It's not just you who wants to punch people in the face sometimes. I mean, we've all seen some great levels of hostility. We see this stuff happening online all the time and in our personal lives. And I think the first thing is that we have to have a conviction that what we believe is actually true. And so this is the apologist in me. And for those who maybe aren't familiar with apologetics is just how you make a case for and defend the truth of Christianity, is looking at the evidence for the faith. And a lot of Christians today don't necessarily have any kind of background in that, because I don't think the church has done a really good job of talking about apologetics, which is a great shame. Because if you do not have the conviction of feeling like, yes, I can be confident that Christianity is true, like we were talking about earlier, it's not just a guess. It's not just, oh, well, this is what I believe because I grew up in America or whatever. But no, this is actually objective truth. It corresponds to reality. When you know that, you're going to be a lot more comfortable standing up for what you believe. You're going to be a lot more comfortable in the face of hostility, because you're going to know, well, this is true, right? And not only is it true, but it's true in a sense that I can read the Bible as God's word to know what God himself, the creator and sustainer of the universe, has said. And he said that the world would hate you if you are not of the world. And so when we come at these conversations from that perspective, it gives us a sense of calmness, I think, because you're so firmly rooted in knowing, well, this is true. Jesus told us this would happen. I know what the Bible teaches. If this is what the creator and sustainer of the universe said, then this person can be yelling at me all they want. They can be insulting me all they want. They can come at me in any way. They can cut me off as a friend, as a family member. It's going to hurt. It's not going to make it easy. It's going to make me sad. It's going to make me angry. But at the same time, I'm going to have a certain peace about it, because I'm going to know that what I am standing up for is actually true. So I think conviction is actually the biggest piece of that. If we can have that conviction, if there's somebody watching or listening who is thinking, well, I don't necessarily have that conviction, I don't know how I would know, necessarily that Christianity is true, I would really encourage you to just take that next step and read some basic apologetics. I always recommend J. Warner Wallace's book, Cold Case Christianity, as a starting point on the Bible. And I think this is the most important area of apologetics that Christians need today, because Christians are going to say, yeah, of course I believe in God, and we're going to pray to God. Obviously, we're going to say that Jesus died for our sins, but we oftentimes don't, according to the research, understand what the Bible actually teaches, and are not necessarily confident that we understand the Bible as God's word. So understanding that is the huge first step, in my opinion.
I've grown up in the South. I live in the South, Southeast part of the United States, and here, going to church is something you do. You go to church. So like when I speak in the Northeast, you don't ask, where do you go to church? You ask, do you go to church? In the South, you ask where. And
I love that. That is such a good distinction.
Well, and it's changing a little bit, but yeah, for the most part, that seems to be the case. But for me, for the first 40 years, even though I attended church, I thought I was a Christian. I really wasn't. I would actually attack Christians on the side. I got kicked out of churches for challenging Christians. But at the same time, if you asked me, I was like, yeah, I'm a Christian. Yeah, I'm going to heaven. Yeah, I mean, like there was like that thought process that I had too often, and I see this once I became a real Christian. I really see it more in the church itself. I see people that they on the surface they appear to be Christians. They probably think they're Christians. But in reality is they're living a life that clearly shows there's no fruit in their life. They're encouraging unrighteousness. They're encouraging a lack of purity in our culture, etc. But for those people who may be listening that kind of think they're a Christian, but really maybe not, Like, how do they deal with that conviction piece you're talking about? Because they if you had asked me and challenged me, I would have gotten angry if you said I wasn't one. But in reality was I wasn't.
Well, I think we have to ask ourselves, well, how would I know if I were a Christian, and who gets to define what a Christian is? Because that's a big conversation that happens today, especially in progressive Christian communities. They
Yeah.
would point to people who hold to what we call the historic Christian faith, and they would say, well, you don't get to define a biblical worldview. You don't get to define who a Christian is. But realistically, if we want to know what a Christian is, we need to go back to what Jesus would have said, right? We need to go back to Jesus himself, because a Christian is a Christ follower. And if we're not getting this information from the Bible, where are we getting it from? Are we just, it's all just our best ideas about who Jesus was, in which case no one has any right to say anything more than anyone else about that. It gets back to this kind of general agnosticism that we see in culture about everything, how you just can't really know. But if we go back to the Bible, which is what we should all be doing to see what Jesus himself said, then we can start to see, well, here's what Jesus taught. Is my life consistent with this? Jesus said, if you love me, you will follow my commands. I think that's just one of the most interesting verses in the Bible. I had a student once who asked me when I was speaking in a chapel to Christian school, we had the Q&A time, and that was his question. He raised his hand and he said, how do I know if I really love Jesus? And I had just read that recently, and I thought, well, that's how, Jesus said, if you love me, you'll keep my commands. So do we know what Jesus commanded? Do we know what he was saying? Well, he said the two greatest commandments are to, number one, love God, and number two, love others. And there's a necessary hierarchy there, because you can't know what it means to love other people unless you first know what it means to love God. To love God is to define and shape our love for others. There are lots of people in the church today who think they're a Christian because they're just going to love others, but they don't let their love for God shape that. So we have to understand what the Bible teaches, and you're not going to know what the Bible teaches about being a Christian and who Jesus is and what Jesus said unless you're reading the Bible. So it comes back to that. Are we willing to spend the time in God's Word? And if somebody listening is thinking, well, I think I know what the Bible teaches. Well, ask yourself, do I? And you're not going to know unless you go back and start reading it. So if you're not reading the Bible, do this. Read one chapter a day. Start at the beginning of the New Testament if you want to do it that way. Start with the book of Matthew, 4 Gospels. Each one tells a different biography of Jesus's life, basically. Different details, but complementary. They harmonize. Start in Matthew, one chapter a day. Everybody can do it. Literally everyone can read a chapter a day. And I think this is the easiest way to get started reading the Bible. Don't feel like you have to jump in and have some giant commentary start. You'll get overwhelmed. One chapter a day. Another great resource I love to recommend to people is Greg Koukl's book, The Story of Reality. It kind of just gives you the big picture story of the Bible. And if everybody in the church honestly understood and accepted and was convicted of that big story of reality that he talks about in the book, which is of course based on the Bible, we would see a completely different church. So even that, making sure you understand this is the big picture of salvation history, is a huge place to start. So maybe get your bearings with something like that and just start reading the Bible a chapter a day. Make sure you're following the actual Jesus who actually exists and not the Jesus you think exists based on what the culture has made him out to be.
I call it meme theology. People like to base their theology off the memes they watch off of Instagram, and they make assumptions off of it. When I became a Christian, and it was a supernatural experience, so I was like, okay, how do I read the Bible? Because I've attempted before, and you get stuck in Leviticus. Like you start in that Old Testament, and like you make it to Leviticus, and you're like, I can't go any further. So I Googled, how to read the Bible as a non-believer. And it gave me a different order of which to read it that was very unique. And I encourage anybody to do it that way who's listening as well. And I like your idea of one chapter a day. I would read for 15 minutes a day. And just 15 minutes is what I would start doing. And sometimes it would be 2 verses because I couldn't get past it. Like there was something that would just stick. And then sometimes it'd be several chapters. But if you can designate 30 minutes to a walk on a treadmill, you can easily do 15 minutes to read God's word. So, well,
Absolutely.
how do churches though now, with based off what you say, because I agree with you completely on this. Like but how should churches disciple, and where do you see? And I'm not talking about progressive churches. I'm not talking about that group of churches, but good Bible believing, spirit filled churches, however you want to say it. How should they be discipling people, and where do you think they're failing now in this area?
When it comes to Bible reading in particular,
Bible reading, or just kind of dealing with culture and using the Bible to deal with culture, because obviously the answer to when culture hates you is you got to be more ingrained in God's word. They kind of go hand in hand. So in dealing with either one of those topics.
Yeah, well, they do go hand in hand, 100%. So, in terms of getting people to read the Bible, just as an example, at our church, our pastor recently just did a whole series. It was 6 or 8 weeks on how to read the Bible, and every week he was actually demonstrating this to the congregation. I go to a huge church, mega church, and so it was awesome to see how he was just very obviously. There are people who read read the Bible a lot in the church, but there are also people which he knows are not reading the Bible in the church. And so he was taking the time to not only dig in deeply, but to show on the screen, like, okay, so here's what I would do as I'm reading this. And he's underlining things and he's circling things. And then every week he was showing a new tool that you can use. So he would bring up an app, or he would show a type of commentary, whatever it was. He was just taking people through how to read the Bible. And that's so basic. And I know that some people who've been Christians for a long time are thinking, man, we should be going way deeper than that. Yes, we should. But if you do a short series on that, you're making sure that you're speaking to everyone there, because you can't assume anymore in our culture that people know how to read the Bible. It's overwhelming. It's like you said, it's like people think of it like, oh, I'm going to start from the beginning, and then they start in Genesis and they're okay, I'm trucking along. And then they get to Leviticus and it's like, okay, this is just as weird as I thought it was going to be going in, because it takes a lot to dig in and study some of those books in the Old Testament, let's be honest. And so I think just being so blatant as to talk about that from the pulpit, but also have a class in your Sunday school, if you have Sunday school program that talks about like reading the Bible better, I think it's so critical today. Like I said, in the past, people just assumed that everybody knows what they're doing with Bible reading. I don't think you can do that today. And then when it comes to the cultural issues, we just need to talk about them from a biblical perspective. I mean, so many pastors are just afraid of tackling controversial issues. Even Bible-believing churches that are rock solid biblically, they don't want to touch it because it's, quote, political. And this is what When Culture Hates You, my book, is really all about, to try to get people to think better about that subject, that we have to be willing to be engaged, to be salt and light in the public square. And we can't be afraid of something because it's supposedly political. All that political means is that it relates to how people living in communities make decisions about how they're going to live together. That's all it is. We can strip away all the baggage and just say, this is where we are. We live in a country, we live together with people in communities, and whether that's going to be on a county or a state or a federal level, we have to make decisions about what it looks like to live in a society where human beings are going to flourish. We want to advocate for the common good. So does everyone else. I talk about this in the book, that ultimately what a culture war is this. It's one group of people saying, I want what's good for society, and another group of people saying, I want what's good for society. No one's saying I want what's bad for society, because we all think we're advocating for what is good and what is right. As Christians, we know, and we should be confident in knowing and saying that we know what's truly good according to God's standards and what is truly wrong according to God's standards. So we should have no fear of advocating accordingly. If we had more pastors, more people in the church who were willing to stand up and be courageous and take that bold stand of saying, look, don't be afraid of something because it's political, that it relates to how we're living together in society. As Christians, we are citizens in this constitutional republic as much as anyone else. So what does the Bible teach about what is good on this issue? What would the Bible say about the sanctity of life? What does the Bible say about gender? What does it say about sexuality? What does it say about these things? Because what's truly good is often hated, and we have to understand that even when we're advocating for what is the best for people, they're often going to hate us for it. We're not going to be bold in the church unless we start seeing more pastors stand up and be bold themselves.
Well, I appreciate that. I will tell you, you spoke, or you interviewed, I think, Michael Easley on a similar topic on this, and I heard that interview, and I thought it was really well done, and that's one of the reasons why I wanted you on the show. And of course, reading your book was outstanding. For people to find out more, to get to your podcast, to find out more, your blog and all of that, how do people find you? Where do they go?
Yeah, so my website is natashacrain.com, and Crain is spelled C-R-A-I-N, not crane like the bird. And you can find everything there about my podcast. It's called the Natasha Crain Podcast, and I have my blog there as well.
Wonderful. Well, Natasha, thank you so much. I appreciate you being here. I can't tell you. I'm glad there are people like you who are writing about things like this. I think it's extremely important as we move into this next chapter of our lives as Christians, and so I thank you so much, and I encourage you to keep going on, because it is very important, and there's going to be a lot of people who are going to want to try to stop it. So thank you so much for that. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much. Appreciated talking with you.
All right, thank you. God bless you.